He rubbed his tired eyes and leaned back in his chair. 40 years in the Navy had taught him that technology, for all its wonders, sometimes created problems that technology alone couldn't solve. The Defender wasn't just any ship. It was the centerpiece of next week's international naval exercise. 6 allied nations would be watching. The political fallout from a U.S. Navy failure would echo through corridors of power around the world. His phone rang, breaking the silence. "Any progress?" he asked, not bothering with hello. He knew it would be Captain Chen calling with the evening update. "None, sir." Chen's voice sounded strained. "The team from Naval Research has tried everything in their playbook. We've replaced parts that didn't even need replacing." "Nothing works," Reynolds sighed. "What about the manufacturer's representatives?" "They're pointing fingers at our maintenance procedures, sir. But our logs are spotless. This ship has been maintained by the book since the day it was commissioned." After ending the call, Reynolds stood up and walked to the window. In his reflection, he saw not the 4-star Admiral of today, but the young ensign he once was, learning the ropes on an old destroyer that had seen better days. Back then, ships were simpler. When something broke, you could see it, touch it, fix it with your hands. A memory stirred at the edge of his mind. Something similar had happened years ago, hadn't it? On the USS Constitution, during his time as a captain. An engine problem that defied explanation. What was it? Who had solved it? He turned back to his computer and began searching through old personnel files. If his memory served him correctly, it had been a chief petty officer, a man with an uncanny ability to diagnose problems that stumped everyone else. Hours passed as Reynolds dug deeper into the archives. Coffee cups piled up on his desk. His aide knocked once, suggesting he get some rest, but Reynolds waved him away. This was too important. Finally, at 3 a.m, he found what he was looking for. Chief Petty Officer Jack Harrington. The name brought the memory into sharp focus. 15 years ago, the Constitution had suffered a mysterious power failure. After a week of failed attempts by the Navy's top engineers, Harrington had fixed the problem in less than a day. No fancy equipment, no advanced degrees, just 30 years of experience and an intimate knowledge of how ships worked. Reynolds pulled up Harrington's full service record, reading it with growing interest. The man had served on 12 different vessels, earned multiple commendations, and developed a reputation for solving impossible mechanical problems. Yet he'd never sought promotion beyond Chief Petty Officer, seemingly content to work directly with the ships he loved rather than climb the leadership ladder. 8 years ago, Harrington had retired. His last evaluation described him as the finest troubleshooter in the fleet and irreplaceable. Reynolds smiled at that. In the Navy, everyone was replaceable, at least in theory. The file listed Harrington's last known address, a small coastal town in Maine. Reynolds checked his watch. It was too early to call, but this couldn't wait. He picked up the phone and dialed a number. "Sir," answered a groggy voice. "Tom, I need you to find someone for me," Reynolds said to his aide. "A retired chief named Jack Harrington. Lives in Maine. I want him on a plane to Norfolk by noon." "Sir, it's 3:30 in the morning." "I'm aware of the time, Lieutenant. This is about the Defender. Find him." As dawn broke over the Pentagon, Reynolds was still at his desk, now surrounded by his senior staff. None of them looked happy about his plan. "With all due respect, Admiral," said Commander Patricia Lopez, his chief of staff, "we have the nation's top engineers working on this problem. What can a retired chief possibly contribute?" "Sometimes the old ways are the best ways," Reynolds replied, unmoved by their skepticism. "Harrington knows ships in a way these young engineers with their computers don't. He listens to them." "Listens to them?" repeated Captain David Wong, raising an eyebrow. "Sir, ships don't talk." Reynolds fixed him with a steady gaze. "Don't they? Ask any old sailor if their ship talks to them. They'll tell you every vessel has its own voice. Harrington speaks that language better than anyone I've ever known." The meeting ended without consensus, but Reynolds didn't need their agreement. He'd made his decision. As the others filed out, his aide entered with a note. "We found him, sir. He wasn't at the address in his file. Apparently he lives on a small boat in the harbor now. Local fishermen knew him. And he's reluctant. Says he's been out of the Navy for 8 years and wants to stay that way." Reynolds stood up, a determined look on his face. "Book me on the next flight to Maine. Some things need to be handled personally. The small coastal town of Harbor Point, Maine, was a world away from the high-pressure environment of the Pentagon. As Reynolds stepped out of his car, still in his full uniform, he breathed in the salty air and listened to the gentle lapping of waves against the docks. A few locals stopped to stare as he made his way down the wooden pier. It wasn't every day that a four-star admiral visited their quiet harbor. At the end of the pier was a modest but well-maintained fishing boat. A weathered sign on its side read, "Second Chance." A man was sitting on the deck working with skilled hands to repair what looked like an old outboard motor. He didn't look up as Reynolds approached. "Chief Harrington?" "Not Chief anymore," the man replied without looking up. "Just Jack now." Reynolds studied him. Harrington was in his 60s, lean and sun-weathered, with calloused hands that spoke of a lifetime of hands-on work. His white hair was cut short in what Reynolds recognized as a habit from his Navy days. "Mind if I come aboard?" Harrington glanced up, taking in the Admiral's uniform with a flicker of recognition but no particular awe. "Your stars don't impress me much these days, but sure, step aboard. Watch your head." Reynolds ducked under the awning and settled onto a bench across from Harrington. Up close, he could see the intelligence in the older man's eyes and the wariness. "You know why I'm here," Reynolds said. "I can guess. Navy's got a problem they can't solve with all their fancy technology, so they're dragging old-timers out of retirement." Harrington turned back to the motor part in his hands. "Not interested. It's the USS Defender. Brand new destroyer. Engine won't start and no one can figure out why. We've got the best engineers in the country working on it and they're all scratching their heads." Something flickered in Harrington's eyes. Curiosity, perhaps, but he shook his head. "Not my problem anymore. I fix boat motors for the local fishermen now. Simple work. Peaceful." Reynolds nodded, understanding the appeal of this quiet life after decades of service. "We're talking about a $2 billion vessel sitting useless in Norfolk. 6 allied nations expecting us to lead an exercise next week. A lot of young sailors whose careers will be affected if we have to pull out. The Navy's got thousands of engineers. You don't need me." "But I do," Reynolds insisted. "I remember what you did on the Constitution 15 years ago. When everyone else was focused on the computer systems, you found the real problem. That loose connection that no one else thought to check." Harrington's hands stilled. "You were the captain." "I was. And I've never forgotten how you solved in hours what the experts couldn't figure out in a week." A seagull landed on the boat's railing, eyeing them curiously before flying off again. The harbor was quiet except for the gentle creaking of boats against their moorings. "I've been out for 8 years," Harrington said finally. "Things have changed. Systems are different now." "Ships are still ships," Reynolds countered. "They still have a heart that pumps in veins that carry power. They still speak to those who know how to listen." Harrington set down his tools and looked out at the water, his expression unreadable. "One day," he said quietly. "I'll give you one day. I'll look at your ship, tell you what I think, and then I'm coming straight back here. No paperwork, no committees, no briefings." Reynolds felt a surge of hope. "That's all I'm asking, and I work alone. No engineers hovering over my shoulder telling me what the computers say." "Agreed." Harrington stood up, stretching his back. "When do we leave?" "There's a car waiting to take us to the airport. We can be in Norfolk by evening." As they walked back down the pier together, Reynolds noticed how the locals nodded respectfully to Harrington. He'd clearly found a place here, a community that valued him. "You know," Harrington said as they reached the car, "I always told the young sailors that ships are like people. They don't always tell you what's wrong directly. Sometimes you have to pay attention to the small signs, the little things they do when they're hurting." Reynolds opened the car door. "That's exactly why we need you, Chief." "Not Chief," Harrington corrected him again, but there was less resistance in his voice now. "Just an old sailor who's heard a few engines in his time." As the car pulled away from the harbor, Reynolds caught Harrington looking back at his boat with a hint of longing. He felt a twinge of guilt for pulling the man from his peaceful retirement, but the Navy needed him. The USS Defender needed him. Sometimes progress meant knowing when to step back and listen to the wisdom of the past. Jack Harrington had forgotten how noisy military bases could be. As he stepped off the helicopter at Norfolk Naval Station with Admiral Reynolds, the familiar sounds washed over him, engines roaring, orders being shouted. The constant hum of a place where thousands of people worked with single-minded purpose. 8 years of quiet Maine harbor life had made this all seem foreign, almost overwhelming. He adjusted the worn duffel bag on his shoulder, conscious of how out of place he looked in his faded jeans and flannel shirt among the crisp uniforms surrounding them. The helicopter blades slowed above them as a young officer approached, saluting the Admiral sharply. "Sir, Captain Chen is waiting for you at the dock." "The situation hasn't improved." Reynolds nodded grimly. "This is Mr. Harrington. He'll be helping with the Defender." The officer glanced at Jack, clearly trying to hide his surprise at the old man's civilian appearance. "Yes, sir. There's a vehicle waiting to take you both to the ship." As they drove through the base toward the waterfront, Jack gazed out the window, memories flooding back with each familiar sight. The last time he'd been here, he'd been turning in his final paperwork, eager to leave this world behind. Now he was back, reluctantly dragged from retirement by an admiral who remembered a fix from 15 years ago. "Having second thoughts?" Reynolds asked, noticing his silence. "I had second thoughts before I got on the plane," Jack replied. "Now I'm having third and fourth thoughts." The car rounded a corner and suddenly there it was, the USS Defender, sleek and imposing against the dock. Unlike the ships Jack had served on, this vessel was all smooth lines and advanced technology, a floating testament to modern naval engineering. Despite himself, he felt a stirring of professional curiosity. "Quite a sight, isn't she?" Reynolds said. "Different from my day," Jack acknowledged. "Lot more computer terminals, lot fewer actual switches and gauges, I'd bet." As they approached the gangway, a group of officers stood waiting. At their center was Captain Chen, looking tired but standing tall, maintaining the appearance of command despite the crisis. "Admiral," Chen saluted. "The team from General Dynamics brought in more diagnostic equipment this morning. Still no progress." Reynolds made quick introductions. "This is Jack Harrington, former Chief Petty Officer. He's going to take a look at your engine problem." The skepticism on the faces around them was unmistakable. Jack had expected it. To these young officers with their advanced degrees and cutting-edge training, he probably looked like a relic, an old man brought in by an admiral clinging to outdated methods. "With all due respect, sir," said a civilian in a tailored suit who introduced himself as Dr. Thompson from General Dynamics. "We've had our top engineers working on this for days. We've run every possible diagnostic." "Then you won't mind if Mr. Harrington has a look," Reynolds replied, his tone making it clear this wasn't a request. Sometimes a fresh perspective helps. As they walked through the ship toward the engine room, Jack felt eyes on him from every direction. Sailors and technicians paused in their work to stare at the civilian being escorted by the Admiral himself. He kept his eyes forward, focusing on the task ahead rather than the whispers that followed them. The engine room of the USS Defender was nothing like the ones Jack remembered. Gone were the massive oil-stained machines with their clearly visible parts. In their place stood sleek systems behind protective panels, with digital readouts displaying information that once would have been felt through vibration and sound. Chief Engineer Wilson stepped forward to greet them. Unlike the others, his expression showed desperate hope rather than skepticism. Here was a man at the end of his rope, willing to try anything. "We've replaced every component that showed even the slightest irregularity," Wilson explained, leading them toward the main propulsion system. "The computer diagnostics show everything functioning normally, but when we try to start the engines..." He pressed a sequence of buttons on a nearby console. The digital displays came to life, showing green status indicators across the board. There was a low hum as systems powered up, a whine as the starter engaged. And then... nothing. The engine that should have roared to life remained silent. "That's it," Wilson said, frustration evident in his voice. "That's what happens every time." Jack moved closer to the engine housing, his eyes scanning the setup. Everything looked immaculate, too immaculate almost. In his experience, working engines were never this clean. "I'd like some time alone with it," he said quietly. Dr. Thompson stepped forward. "That's highly irregular. This is sensitive military technology." "It's a broken engine," Jack interrupted. "And right now it's about as useful as a paperweight. Admiral Reynolds vouched for me, and that should be enough. I need to listen to this ship without 20 experts telling me what their computers say." Reynolds nodded to Captain Chen, who reluctantly ordered everyone out. As the room emptied, Jack could hear muttered comments about old-school nonsense and wasting precious time. When they were gone, Jack set his duffel bag down and pulled out a few simple tools: a stethoscope, a small mirror on an extendable handle, a notebook worn at the edges. He took off his jacket, rolled up his sleeves, and began to do what he did best: listen. For the next hour, he moved methodically around the engine, sometimes pressing the stethoscope against different components, sometimes simply placing his palm against the metal to feel for vibrations. He jotted notes in his book, made sketches, and occasionally closed his eyes as if trying to hear something just beyond normal perception. To an observer, it might have looked like a strange ritual. But Jack was conducting a conversation with the ship in the only way he knew how, treating it not as a collection of parts but as a living thing with its own language. When he finally sat down on a nearby stool, the room was silent except for the soft hum of auxiliary systems. Outside, he knew the Navy's finest minds were waiting impatiently, probably convinced he was wasting their time. Let them think what they wanted. Jack flipped through his notebook, reviewing his observations. Modern ships like the Defender were designed to be diagnosed by computers, their ailments revealed through data rather than sound or feel. But some problems couldn't be captured by sensors. They existed in the spaces between measurements, in the way systems interacted with each other. His thoughts were interrupted as the engine room door opened and Chief Engineer Wilson poked his head in. "Admiral Reynolds asked me to check if you needed anything," Wilson said, clearly uncomfortable. Jack considered the question. "I need the maintenance logs. Not the computerized summaries, the actual handwritten notes from whoever worked on this engine last." Wilson looked surprised. "Nobody keeps handwritten logs anymore. Everything's digital." "Somebody does," Jack insisted. "Every good engineer keeps personal notes, things they notice but don't put in the official record." "I need those." After Wilson left, Jack continued his examination, moving deeper into the engine's inner workings. The Defender's propulsion system was a marvel of engineering, a hybrid design that combined traditional mechanical elements with cutting-edge technology. But somewhere in this complex maze was a flaw that all their sophisticated diagnostics couldn't detect. Hours passed. Outside, the sun began to set, casting long shadows through the few portholes in the engine room. Jack lost track of time, absorbed in his work, unaware of the growing tension on the ship as officers and engineers waited for some sign of progress. When Wilson returned, he carried a small, oil-stained notebook. "Found this in Senior Chief Patel's locker. He's been overseeing maintenance on the engine since the ship was commissioned. Said he keeps personal notes but never thought they'd be important." Jack took the notebook gratefully, flipping through pages of cramped handwriting and rough sketches. Here was what he needed, not the sanitized data from computer logs, but the observations of someone who worked with this engine every day, who noticed its quirks and peculiarities. A note on page 37 caught his eye. "Valve assembly makes unusual sound during cooldown cycle. Within specs, but worth watching." He looked up at Wilson. "When did the problem start?" "Exactly when. After routine maintenance 3 days ago. We shut down for standard checks, and when we tried to restart, nothing." Jack finished for him. He turned back to the notebook, scanning for more mentions of the valve assembly. There it was again, a note from 2 months earlier. "Slight vibration in secondary cooling valve. Manufacturer says normal but doesn't feel right." Jack stood up, suddenly energized. "I need to see the maintenance records from 3 days ago. Who worked on the cooling system?" As Wilson pulled up the records on a nearby terminal, Jack felt a familiar excitement building, the sensation of pieces falling into place, of a machine revealing its secrets. This was why he had joined the Navy all those years ago. This moment of discovery when a ship told you what was wrong if you just knew how to listen. The records showed that during routine maintenance, a technician had adjusted the secondary cooling valve, the same one mentioned in Patel's personal notes. According to the official log, the adjustment had been minor, well within acceptable parameters. But Jack knew from experience that sometimes the most catastrophic failures came from the smallest deviations. A fraction of a millimeter in the wrong place could bring a mighty engine to its knees. "I think I know what's wrong," he said quietly. "But I'll need a few more hours to be sure, and I'll need some very specific tools." As Wilson hurried off to relay the request, Jack turned back to the silent engine, a half smile on his weathered face. "You're trying to tell them what's wrong," he murmured to the machine. "But they don't speak your language, do they? Don't worry. I'm listening now." Morning light streamed through the portholes of the USS Defender, catching dust motes in golden beams as Captain Chen led a procession of increasingly frustrated experts toward the engine room. The ship had been dead in the water for 4 days now. With each passing hour, the pressure from Naval Command grew more intense, and the mood on board more desperate. Behind Chen walked Admiral Reynolds, flanked by Dr. Thompson from General Dynamics and Professor Alan Wright, a renowned mechanical engineer flown in overnight from MIT. Bringing up the rear were 3 naval engineers, each carrying tablets filled with diagnostic data that had proven useless so far. I still don't understand why this retired chief gets unlimited access while my team has been restricted. Dr. Thompson complained, not for the first time. We built this engine. We know every bolt and circuit. And yet it's still not working, Reynolds replied calmly. Let's see what Harrington has found. As they approached the engine room, they heard something unexpected. A soft, rhythmic tapping, like metal against metal. Chen pushed open the door to find Jack Harrington on his knees beside an open access panel, a small metal file in his hand. His shirt was stained with grease and tools were spread out around him in a precise pattern that made sense only to him. What in God's name are you doing? Dr. Thompson burst out, rushing forward. That's a precision component. You can't just file it down like some backyard project. Jack didn't even look up. I'm fixing your ship, he said simply, continuing his careful work. Chen stepped between them before Thompson could grab the file from Jack's hands. Mr. Harrington, perhaps you could explain what you found? Jack sat back on his heels, wiping sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand. His eyes, despite his obvious fatigue, were clear and focused. Your cooling valve assembly has a manufacturing defect, he said, pointing to a component smaller than a man's palm. It's technically within tolerances, that's why your computers didn't flag it, but it's causing micro-vibrations that throw the entire startup sequence out of alignment. The group stared at the tiny valve component. It looked perfectly normal to their eyes. That's impossible, Professor Wright said, adjusting his glasses. The computer diagnostics would have detected any vibration above the threshold that could affect performance. Jack stood up slowly, his knees cracking slightly. He picked up a stethoscope from his toolkit and offered it to the professor. Computers measure what we tell them to measure, he said. They look where we tell them to look. But machines talk to us in ways that can't always be captured by sensors. Here, listen for yourself. Reluctantly, Professor Wright took the stethoscope and placed it against the valve housing as Jack directed. After a moment, his eyebrows rose in surprise. There is an unusual resonance, he admitted. But it's so slight. How could this possibly stop the entire engine from functioning? Jack picked up Senior Chief Patel's maintenance notebook from where it lay open beside his tools. According to these notes, this valve has been making unusual sounds for months. Nothing serious enough to report officially, but noticeable to someone who works with the engine every day. He turned to one of the naval engineers. When you performed the routine maintenance 3 days ago, you adjusted this valve, correct? The young engineer nodded. It was within the standard procedure. We adjusted it to the exact specifications in the manual. And that's the problem, Jack said. This valve needed to be slightly out of spec to compensate for the manufacturing defect. When you fixed it to match the book, you actually broke it. Dr. Thompson looked unconvinced. That makes no sense. Our specifications are precise for a reason. If the valve meets those specifications, it should work perfectly. In theory, yes, Jack agreed. In reality, no machine is perfect. Every ship I've ever served on had quirks, things that didn't quite match the blueprints but worked anyway. Good engineers know when to follow the manual and when to trust their ears and hands. Admiral Reynolds stepped forward, his expression thoughtful. You're saying this minor imperfection was actually keeping the engine running properly? Exactly, Jack nodded. When they fixed it during maintenance, they broke the balance. It's like an old truck that needs you to pump the gas pedal twice before starting. If you follow the normal procedure, it won't start. But if you know its quirks, you can get it running every time. Captain Chen looked at the engine, then back at Jack. So what are you doing with that file? I'm restoring the imperfection, Jack explained. Creating a slight burr that will change the resonance frequency just enough to allow the startup sequence to proceed normally. The experts exchanged skeptical glances. What Jack was proposing went against everything they had been taught about precision engineering and modern naval systems. This is highly irregular, Professor Wright said. You're suggesting we deliberately introduce an imperfection into a $2 billion warship? Jack shrugged. I'm suggesting we make it work. Isn't that the goal? There was a tense silence as the group considered his words. Finally, Admiral Reynolds spoke. How long will you need to finish? Another hour, maybe two, Jack replied. Then we can try starting the engine. Reynolds nodded decisively. Do it. Everyone else, give him space to work. As the group filed out, Dr. Thompson lingered, clearly unhappy, but unable to override the Admiral's order. Jack waited until they were alone before returning to his careful filing, removing microns of metal with each precise stroke. For the next 2 hours, he worked in solitude, occasionally consulting Patel's notes or pressing his stethoscope against the valve to check his progress. This was the kind of work that couldn't be rushed, the kind of delicate adjustment that came from decades of experience rather than textbook knowledge. Outside the engine room, tension mounted as word spread throughout the ship that the old man might have found the problem. Sailors gathered in small groups, discussing the situation in hushed tones. Many were skeptical. How could this retired chief succeed where so many experts had failed? Others, especially the older crew members, were more hopeful. They had seen enough in their careers to know that sometimes old-school knowledge trumped modern technology. In the officers' mess, Admiral Reynolds sat with Captain Chen and Chief Engineer Wilson, nursing cups of coffee that had long since gone cold. Do you really think this will work? Chen asked quietly. Reynolds considered the question. I've seen Harrington work before. He understands ships in a way that's hard to explain. It's not just technical knowledge, it's almost like he can feel what's wrong. But filing down a component by hand? Wilson shook his head in disbelief. If he's wrong, he could damage it beyond repair. Sometimes you have to trust experience over data, Reynolds replied. That's something we've forgotten in this age of computers and sensors. Their conversation was interrupted as a young ensign appeared at the door, slightly out of breath. Sirs, Mr. Harrington says he's ready to test the engine. The engine room was crowded as Jack made his final preparations. Despite Admiral Reynolds' order for space, everyone who could find an excuse to be present had squeezed in, forming a ring of observers around the main control panel. The air was thick with anticipation and doubt in equal measure. Jack had cleaned up his workspace, his tools neatly packed away except for the stethoscope which hung around his neck. His hands were clean now, though the grease stains on his shirt remained as evidence of his labor. Before we begin, he said, addressing the room, I want to be clear about what I've done. I haven't replaced any parts or rewired any systems. I've simply restored a balance that existed before the maintenance. If I'm right, the engine will start normally. If I'm wrong. He left the sentence unfinished, but everyone understood the stakes. This was their last hope before the Defender would be pulled from the international exercise, a failure that would echo through the Navy for years to come. Chief Engineer, Wilson took his position at the main control panel. Ready when you are, Mr. Harrington. Jack nodded, then placed his stethoscope against the valve housing one last time, listening intently. After a moment, he straightened up and gave Wilson a thumbs up. Start the sequence. Wilson's fingers moved across the controls, initiating the same startup procedure that had failed dozens of times over the past 4 days. Status indicators flashed green across the screen as systems came online one by one. The familiar hum built throughout the room as power flowed into the propulsion system. The starter engaged with its characteristic whine. This was the point where the sequence had always stopped before. For a heart-stopping moment, nothing happened. Jack's expression remained calm, but his knuckles whitened as he gripped the railing beside him. Then came a new sound, a deep, throaty rumble that quickly built into a powerful roar as the massive engine sprang to life. The deck vibrated beneath their feet as the propulsion system engaged fully for the first time in days. The room erupted in cheers and applause. Engineers clapped each other on the back, sailors whooped with joy, and even the stern-faced Dr. Thompson broke into a reluctant smile. In the midst of the celebration, Jack stood quietly, listening to the engine's steady rhythm with a slight smile on his weathered face. This was the sound he had been waiting for, the voice of a ship running as it should. Admiral Reynolds approached, extending his hand. You did it, Chief. Jack shook the offered hand. Not Chief anymore, remember? And it wasn't just me. It was Senior Chief Patel's notes that pointed me in the right direction. He knew something was off with that valve long before it became a problem. As the excitement continued around them, Jack noticed a group of young engineers watching him with newfound respect in their eyes. These were the next generation of naval technicians, raised on computers and digital diagnostics. Perhaps today they had learned something that couldn't be taught in a classroom or coded into a program. "How did you know?" one of them asked, stepping forward. "How did you know where to look when all our equipment showed nothing wrong?" Jack considered the question, trying to put into words something that had always been more instinct than knowledge for him. "Machines speak a language all their own," he said finally. "Modern technology is amazing, but it can only detect what it's programmed to find. Some problems can only be heard by human ears and felt by human hands. That's something no computer will ever replace." As he looked around at the now functioning engine room, Jack felt a familiar sense of satisfaction, the simple joy of making something work again. For all his reluctance to return, he had to admit that he had missed this feeling. Captain Chen approached, his face split in a wide grin. "Mr. Harrington, I don't know how to thank you. You've saved this ship and all our careers." Jack nodded acknowledgement. "She's a fine vessel, Captain. Treat her well, and listen when she talks to you." As the celebration continued, Jack slipped away quietly, heading for the deck. He needed some fresh air and a moment alone before the inevitable debriefings began. His job was done. The ship was running again. And soon, he could return to his peaceful life in Maine, with a new story to tell the local fishermen on quiet evenings at the harbor. Jack Harrington stood at the railing of the USS Defender's deck, breathing in the salty air as the ship hummed with renewed life beneath his feet. The engine was running smoothly now, its powerful rhythm a testament to his unconventional fix. Behind him, the naval base bustled with activity as preparations for the international exercise resumed with renewed urgency. He checked his watch. His flight back to Maine would leave in 4 hours. True to his word, Admiral Reynolds had arranged for his quick departure once the job was done. 1 day on the ship, one simple fix, and then back to his quiet life by the harbor. That had been the deal. The sound of footsteps on the deck made him turn. Captain Chen approached, accompanied by Chief Engineer Wilson and a small group of young naval engineers. Their faces showed a mixture of respect, curiosity, and lingering disbelief. "Mr. Harrington," Chen began, "before you leave, my engineering team was hoping you might share some insights. What you did with that valve, it goes against everything they've been taught about modern naval systems." Jack smiled slightly. He recognized the look in the young engineer's eyes, the hunger for knowledge that couldn't be found in textbooks or computer programs. "I've got a little time," he conceded, turning to face them fully. "What do you want to know?" One of the younger engineers, Lieutenant Lisa Rodriguez, stepped forward. "The computer diagnostics showed that valve was within specifications. How did you know it was the problem?" Jack leaned against the railing. "Specifications are guidelines, not gospel. That valve was technically within tolerance, but it was at the very edge of acceptable parameters. Combined with its position in the cooling system, that created a subtle resonance that threw off the startup sequence." "But how did you detect it without instruments?" another engineer asked. Jack tapped his ear. "I listened. When I put my stethoscope on that valve housing, I could hear a vibration that wasn't quite right. A bit like a guitar string that's almost in tune but not quite. Your sensors weren't programmed to flag it because individually each measurement was within limits." Chief Engineer Wilson nodded slowly. "So the whole was greater than the sum of its parts. Each component was technically acceptable, but together they created a problem." "Exactly," Jack agreed. "Machines are like that. They're not just collections of parts. They're systems that interact in complex ways. Sometimes those interactions create problems that don't show up on diagnostics." He reached into his pocket and pulled out Senior Chief Patel's maintenance notebook. "This was my real diagnostic tool. Patel noticed months ago that something wasn't quite right with that valve. He heard it, felt it, but since it was technically within specs, he just made a note and kept an eye on it." Jack handed the notebook to Wilson. "You might want to digitize this, but don't stop your people from keeping their own notes. There's wisdom in these pages that no computer can capture." The group gathered closer as Jack continued, his voice taking on the natural rhythm of a man sharing hard-won knowledge. "In my day, we didn't have computers telling us what was wrong. We developed what the old-timers called mechanical sympathy, an understanding of how machines feel when they're running right and when they're not. We used all our senses, listening for unusual sounds, feeling for vibrations, even smelling for anything out of the ordinary. Like a doctor with a patient, Rodriguez suggested. Jack nodded. That's not a bad comparison. A good doctor doesn't just run tests, they talk to the patient, observe symptoms, use their experience to make connections that might not show up on a lab report. Admiral Reynolds joined the group, having overseen the final engine tests below. Share with them what you did with the file, Jack. That's the part that really goes against conventional wisdom. Jack pulled a small metal file from his back pocket. It was an ordinary tool, worn smooth from decades of use. Modern engineering is all about precision. Parts manufactured to exact specifications, fitted together perfectly. But sometimes perfect isn't actually perfect. Sometimes a machine needs a little humanity. He demonstrated with his hands how he had carefully filed the valve component. I didn't just remove metal randomly. I restored an imperfection that was actually helping the engine run properly, a compensation for other small variances throughout the system. The engineers exchanged glances, clearly struggling with this concept that contradicted their training. Think of it like this, Jack continued. If you have a door that sticks slightly, you might plane down the edge a bit. You're not following the original blueprint anymore, but you're making it work better in the real world. Ships are full of these little adjustments, unofficial fixes that experienced engineers make because they know the difference between theory and practice. Captain Chen stepped forward. What concerns me is that we might face this same problem after the next maintenance cycle. If everything is reset to factory specifications, that's why knowledge transfer is so important, Jack said, gesturing to the notebook in Wilson's hands. Patel knew about this quirk, but when the maintenance team came in, they didn't check his notes. They just followed the manual. He looked at the young engineers gathered around him. Technical knowledge is important, but it's not enough. You need to build a relationship with your ship, understand its personality, and you need to pass that understanding on to whoever comes after you. As the morning wore on, the impromptu lesson continued. Jack walked the group through the engine room, pointing out places where human judgment should supersede computer readings, explaining how to distinguish between normal operational sounds and warning signs of trouble. The young engineers followed eagerly, occasionally taking notes or asking questions. For Jack, it was a strangely satisfying experience. 8 years of retirement had given him perspective on his career, on the knowledge he had accumulated over decades of service. Knowledge that he now realized might be lost if not passed on to this new generation of technicians raised on digital diagnostics and computer-aided design. By midday, Admiral Reynolds approached with a reminder that Jack's transport to the airport would be leaving soon. One last thing before you go, Reynolds said. The Joint Chiefs are extremely pleased with the outcome here. They've authorized me to offer you a consulting position, part-time on your own schedule. We have other ships with unusual problems that have stumped our regular teams. Jack's immediate instinct was to refuse. He had built a peaceful life in Maine, far from the pressures and politics of the Navy. But as he looked around at the eager faces of the young engineers, he felt a tug of responsibility. I'll think about it, he said finally. No promises. Reynolds nodded, knowing better than to push. Fair enough. Your ride's waiting whenever you're ready. As Jack gathered his few belongings and prepared to leave, Chief Engineer Wilson approached with an unusual request. Before you go, would you mind if we recorded you describing how you diagnosed the problem? It would be invaluable for our training programs. Jack hesitated, never having been comfortable in the spotlight, but the sincerity in Wilson's request was hard to refuse. Keep it short, he agreed reluctantly. In the ship's small media room, Jack found himself facing a camera, with Lieutenant Rodriguez asking questions from behind it. Initially stiff and self-conscious, he gradually relaxed as he spoke about the things he knew best: the language of machines, the importance of listening, the value of experience over pure data. The most important tool any engineer has isn't in their toolbox, he concluded. It's the knowledge passed down from one generation to the next. Technology changes, but the principles remain the same. Listen to your ship, respect its quirks, and remember that sometimes the simplest solution is the right one. When it was over, Jack made his way to the gangway where Admiral Reynolds waited to see him off. The ship was alive with activity now, sailors and officers moving with purpose as final preparations for the exercise continued on schedule. I meant what I said about that consulting offer. Reynolds said as they shook hands. Think it over. The Navy could use your kind of expertise. Jack nodded noncommittally. I'll let you know. As he descended the gangway, he heard someone call his name. Turning, he saw Lieutenant Rodriguez hurrying toward him, carrying what looked like a framed certificate. We wanted you to have this, she said, slightly out of breath as she handed it to him. It's not much, but Jack looked down at the simple frame. Inside was a handwritten note signed by every member of the engineering team, thanking him for his help and acknowledging the lesson they had learned. Beneath the signatures was a quote. Sometimes you need to listen to the ship, not just the sensors. For a moment, Jack was too surprised to speak. In all his years of service, he had received his share of official commendations, but nothing had quite the meaning of this spontaneous gesture of respect from the next generation. Thank you, he said simply, carefully tucking the frame into his duffel bag. As his car pulled away from the dock, Jack looked back at the USS Defender, its powerful silhouette outlined against the sky. For all its advanced technology and sophisticated systems, it had needed something that couldn't be programmed or manufactured. The human touch, the wisdom of experience, the ability to listen beyond the data. Maybe that consulting position wasn't such a bad idea after all. There were other ships out there, other problems that computers couldn't solve, and there were young engineers who needed to learn what textbooks couldn't teach them. Jack smiled to himself as the naval base receded in the distance. His quiet retirement would still be waiting for him in Maine, but perhaps there was room in his life for the occasional return to the world of ships and sailors, not as a duty now, but as a choice. A way to pass on what he knew before it was lost. The Admiral had been right about one thing. Every ship had its own voice, and there were still people who needed to learn how to listen.